Did you know the Vikings, those raiders from the north, were actually Muslim? Well, it's being taught to pupils in British schools, or at least that's the story being reported by several right-wing media outlets in the United Kingdom. But is it true? Were there Muslim Vikings? And is it being taught at school? For those of you new to the channel, my name is Hilbert Podcast. I read Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic at the University of Cambridge, and Viking and medieval history at the University of Oslo. While Norse contacts with the Islamic world aren't my area of expertise, it is something I've researched in the past and written about too. I've also been vocal about the politicization of certain topics, for example when there were calls to scrap my course because it contained the term Anglo-Saxon. Many commentators online have seen this latest claim as the same over-politicization of the past. I agree, at least to a point, but there's a lot more to the story of the Vikings and their interactions outside Europe than many of these reactionary articles claim. So keep an open mind as we go through some of these claims and see what you think. The story can be traced back to the Telegraph, who reported on the 31st of May that the brilliant club had advised schools to tell their pupils that the Vikings were not all white and were a very diverse group of people with very diverse religious beliefs, and that some Vikings became practising Muslims. The Brilliant Club is a charity which aims to give students from disadvantaged backgrounds a chance of studying at the most competitive universities. The Telegraph further reports that the Brilliant Club has created two Decolonizing the Curriculum courses which aim to replace Eurocentric and colonial approaches in order to access children from minority ethnic backgrounds. Is there any stock in these claims? Let's start with the question of Muslim Vikings. The Norse had extensive contact with the Muslim world. In general, this occurred in three distinct zones: contact with Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa, contact with Muslims in the Middle East and the Eurasian Steppe, and contact with Muslims travelling to Scandinavia. The first two involved the Norse sailing out and meeting Muslims abroad, while the last concerns several individuals travelling from the Islamic world to Northern Europe. Vikings were probably in part motivated to start their famous maritime expeditions on account of the huge wealth in silver coins, known as dirhams, being produced particularly by the Islamic Caliphate in the Middle East. In the course of the 7th and the 8th centuries, Arab Muslims had been able to capture many former Roman provinces in both the Levant and North Africa. This included Syria, conquered in AD 640, a particularly wealthy province because of the mint at Damascus, which continued to operate and expand for its new owners. Though at first they used Roman designs, the Caliphate soon fashioned the dirham, a silver coin containing the Shahada, the Muslim declaration of faith in one God and Muhammad as his messenger. Through trade networks, these coins circulated steadily northwards, up the rivers of Eastern Europe like the Volga, Dnieper and Dniester. A now out-of-date estimate gives an impression of the numbers involved. There were over 85,000 Arabic coins that have been found in Sweden, particularly on the islands of Gotland and Öland, with another 100,000 in Norse contexts in Russia and 700 and 5,000 from Norway and Denmark respectively. Many of these likely came through non-Muslim middlemen, like the Khazars or various Slavic or steppe peoples the Norse interacted with. But there is substantial written evidence from the Muslim world that demonstrates direct contact as well. However, whether the Norse realised that they were using Islamic coins with a religious message is harder to establish. The Anglo-Saxon king Offa, who ruled in the middle of the 8th century around the start of the Viking Age, had a coin minted which is clearly a copy of a dinar, the golden version of the Islamic silver dirham. It has the words Offa Rex, King Offa, in Latin, but on the back, where normally the Shahada pledge is inscribed, the coin simply has squiggles meant to look like Arabic. This clearly isn't Offa proclaiming his faith in Allah. This is simply an Anglo-Saxon king with a global outlook copying a coin, perhaps to trade with the Islamic world, or more likely to emulate the wealth coming from the Far East. For the Norse, who unlike Offa had extensive direct contact with Muslims, there is some evidence to suggest they did understand what the Shahada on their coins meant. There are around 15,000 cases of graffitied coins in northwestern Europe, where the Shahada has been inscribed with runic inscriptions or quote-unquote magical symbols, and sometimes with other images of weapons or boats. Of a smaller sample that was studied, 12 contained the Thor's hammer, while 28 were inscribed with Christian crosses. The Norwegian archaeologist Egil Mikkelsen explains the possible significance. Islam must have been a well-known religion among Vikings travelling in the east. It is likely that they knew some of the main aspects of the Islamic doctrine, and must surely also have been aware of the fact that the Arabic texts found on the coins conveyed messages from this religion. When our ancestors scratched Thor's hammers and crosses on the surface of the Arabic coins, they must presumably have wanted to show that they disassociated themselves with the other faith, Islam. During the Viking Age, people of northern Europe tried, for some reason or other, to render the quotations from the Quran harmless, or to confront Allah with their own Norse or Christian god by scratching their symbols over the Islamic messages. This then appears to be evidence for Norse people who actively did not wish to associate themselves with the Islamic faith, even if they were more than happy to take and use their coins. Other artifacts found in Scandinavia may point in the other direction. A bronze vessel from Aska in western Sweden is of a type that archaeologists suggest was produced in either West Turkestan, Samarkand or Bukhara. It contains an Arabic inscription. El Fadl el Akmalwa la San Kabisa Lillah. The most perfect and beneficent and most beautiful gift is for God. Archaeologists believe this inscription was added at a later date than the vessel's production, and by someone unfamiliar with Arabic letters. An almost identical vessel with the same inscription was found at Bertby on the island of Åland, and were likely made by the same person. In Islamic contexts, such vessels were often used for ritual ablution, wudu, compulsory before praying at the mosque. However, in the burial context in Scandinavia, there is no indication they were used for this purpose at all, as they were found filled with mostly Arabic coins and buried in richly adorned graves that cannot have belonged to devout Muslims, as Islam forbids being buried with grave goods. Several artifacts found in Scandinavia contain the name Allah. Most recently, media reported on several garments from Uppsala and Birka containing the Arabic names Allah and Ali, God and the name of Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali. He is particularly revered by Shia Muslims, and his name is found together with that of God in early Shia mystics' tombs and books. However, the fact that Allah appears in mirrored letters suggests it was copied by someone unfamiliar with the correct orientation. It also lacks the phrase Wali Allah, friend of Allah, which accompanies all of these inscriptions when found in mainstream Shia contexts from the period. That again suggests it was copied incorrectly by an outsider. As the archaeologist who made the discovery summarized, the possibility that some of those in the graves were Muslim cannot be completely ruled out. We know from other Viking tomb excavations that DNA analysis has shown some of the people buried in them originated from places like Persia, where Islam was very dominant. However, it is more likely these findings show that Viking Age burial customs were influenced by Islamic ideas such as eternal life in paradise after death. Not everyone agreed. Stephanie Mulder, Associate Professor of Islamic Art and Architecture at the University of Texas in Austin, highlighted serious issues with the chronology. The boat burials in which these textiles were found dated to the 9th and 10th centuries, but the kind of Kufic Arabic script archaeologists identified wouldn't develop for another 500 years after the Viking Age. Writing on Twitter, Professor Mulder stated, "It's a style called square Kufic, and it's common in Iran, Central Asian architecture after 15th century. She continued that even if these textiles inscribed with an earlier form of kufik, the word on Larsson's drawing doesn't spell Allah at all, but rather spells illah, which does not make sense in Arabic, as this is a form of a word that cannot stand on its own but must be embedded in a longer sentence. She identifies a difference between the photograph of the textile and Larsson's drawing, which added extra strokes to make the form Allah. There are other artifacts that undisputably do have the word Allah written in Arabic on them, found in Scandinavia. In 2015, a finger ring made of gilded silver and a violet amethyst stone was reported on from the Viking Age town of Birka. What set it apart was the inscription in the jewel reading Allah, which has been interpreted as for or to the approval of Allah. Further analysis showed the ring to be coloured glass rather than amethyst, and the material of the band to be silver alloy. The surface showed no signs of wear, with the original file marks in place, suggesting an object that didn't pass through many middlemen in an extensive trade network, but rather a direct transfer. This is in stark contrast to the dirhams, which show lots of signs of wear and tear. As the ring was found in the grave of a woman, suggestions range from the idea that either the woman came from or had been to the caliphate, or perhaps had been given the ring by someone who was or had. Yet again, the form of the Kufik script is faulty and probably an imitation rather than the genuine product. This would point to the wearer being someone who could appreciate the Kufik style but couldn't read it, and lessens the likelihood that the ring bearer came from the caliphate. Arabic written sources record rings of this type commonly being given as gifts from Muslim traders, and then particularly to women. Another set of artifacts that might point to Muslims in Scandinavia are balances and weights used for weighing the metal content of various tenders like coins and hack silver. A few of these have Arabic symbols or letters inscribed, though again these are imperfectly done. One example from the island of Gotland has been interpreted as Rasul Allah, Allah's prophet, and Bak, excellent or good. It's been suggested this might have been some kind of warranty control. The word Bak is also found on two other weights from Scandinavia. The large number of Islamic weights found in graves at Birka have led some researchers to argue for the presence of Muslim traders at the site. Other artifacts from the cemetery include so-called Oriental costumes of both female and male attire. The vestments in question consist of silk, as well as other gold and silver artifacts showing connections to both Eastern Europe and perhaps further afield. However, most scholars see these graves as representative of people who had travelled to the East, likely in a mercantile capacity, rather than being Muslims who were buried in Birka. The exchange of costumes is well documented in Arabic sources, for instance. Objects specific to religion rather than broader Islamic culture have been suggested, though interpretations vary. One artifact has been interpreted as a censer, that is, an ornamental cup which holds incense. It was found together with a fragment of an oil lamp and 3 tongs in central Sweden. The censer has been identified as coming from Khorasan, in modern-day Iran, and contained an inscription reading Bismillah, in the name of God, and Rahim, merciful. It's safe to say that at one point in this object's history this had been a religious item, though whether it fulfilled a religious function in Sweden is difficult to say. Its fine context again suggests it was rather brought to Scandinavia through trade, gift exchange, or plunder by a Norseman or perhaps Norsewoman. Another category of religious object are rock crystal and cornelian beads, many of which were likely produced in Gujarat, today's India. These objects were often given as votive gifts by Buddhists, while Muslims used them as rosary beads. However, there is no sign of a religious connotation in the Scandinavian examples, where they're usually found as parts of necklaces belonging to women. Theories around the transfer of ideas and material culture suggest a positive inclination towards the source of origin is one requirement, as is intensity, frequency, and variation in contact. This does not appear to be what is found when it concerns Islamic artifacts in Scandinavia. Their objects were treated as luxury commodities and reshaped into symbols that made sense within a Norse cultural framework. For example, this is why rosary beads appear in female graves, as in Norse contexts women are far more frequently found with beads than men. The fact that they have been turned into a different item, a necklace, also suggests a different, non-religious purpose, and therefore a lack of understanding, or at least apathy, towards its original religious purpose. Some of the best evidence for Norsemen inside the Caliphate might come from Scandinavia itself. A series of 26 rune stones are known as the Ingvar stones, given that they all describe individuals who accompanied a certain Ingvar on an expedition to Serkland, the Old Norse name for the Saracens' land. However, none of these or any runestones proclaim those mentioned as Muslims or contain Islamic imagery, which is in opposition to the majority of Swedish runestones that have got overtly Christian messages or imagery. One runestone, dated to between 1010 and 1040 from central Sweden, contains the word Karusum, which has been interpreted as Khwarazm, which is located between the Aral Sea and the Amu Darja estuary in Central Asia. However, the rest of the inscription frequently has misspellings, as runic inscriptions often do, and so the phrase Oyster I Karusum might instead be interpreted as Oyster I Garðum, with Garðum being the Old Norse term for the Rus lands. The archaeologist Mats Roslund argues this is more likely, given by the 11th century the source of silver in Scandinavian dirhams no longer came from Central Asia, and that no Arabic sources name Scandinavians trading in the Near East after AD 900. That said, something intangible like belief isn't always visible archaeologically. Several scholars of early Islam note the rarity of the Shahada in early Islamic societies, and that political and ideological factors were important in the adoption of visible material statements of Muslimness. In their article on the possibility of Vikings converting to Islam, Knudsen and Ellis argue that in an overwhelmingly oral culture like that of the Norse, early converts might not have materially expressed their faith in a similar way that early Muslims also didn't feel the need to do so. However, these supposed converts in Scandinavia were in an entirely different cultural and political sphere to early Muslim converts in the Middle East, and it's hard to imagine how people without knowledge of the Arabic language, Arabic script, or any of the material trappings of Islam might be considered Muslims in the way it's being discussed in this video and indeed in mainstream usage. They go on in the article to lay out several other reasons why burials of Muslim northern Eurasians might be invisible for archaeologists. In this discussion, they argue that a Rus individual could have been identified as Muslim but still have been cremated according to local practices. But is this really likely? The afterlife and burial customs isn't exactly a minor practice when it comes to religion. Other early medieval accounts about the conversion of the Frisian pagan king Redbart in the early 8th century note how he cancelled his baptism halfway through after discovering that his ancestors would not be joining him in the Christian heaven. For Islam, the idea of bodily resurrection can be found directly in the Quran, and he presents for us an example and forgets his own creation. He says, "Who will give life to bones while they are disintegrated? Say, He will give them life who produced them the first time, and He is, of all creation, knowing." Such an idea of the afterlife is incompatible with cremation, which is why this practice isn't followed by Muslims of the same period who instead bury their dead. Ibn Fadlan, whose account we'll explore in more detail in a moment, also records dialogue with the Rus about ideas of the afterlife and how they are none too impressed with the idea of burial. Potential converts to Islam certainly would also have asked such questions, not least to know about their own fate within their new belief set. While there is a possibility that such Muslim converts in Scandinavia, being hypothesized about by Knudsen and Ellis, would be cremated by their pagan fellows, we also must wonder how plausible the idea of individual Muslim converts unsupported by a wider Muslim community might be. Be that as it may, Knudsen and Ellis do make a good point that identifying possible Muslims in Scandinavia might be particularly difficult. Certainly, when Scandinavians began converting to Christianity, archaeologists find many mixed or syncretic traditions combining former cultural or pagan practices with Christian ones. It provides a possible framework for why we haven't found more conclusive evidence of Muslims in Scandinavia, but doesn't actually provide that evidence either. So, on this basis, the most we can say is that it remains a possibility. Of course, all the archaeological evidence is highly open to interpretation. Luckily, there are also several accounts written by Arab authors about their interaction with the Norse. The most famous of these is undoubtedly that of Ahmed ibn Fadlan and the Rus. I've discussed this at length in my video on Ibn Fadlan and the Vikings, and on what the Arabs thought of Vikings in general. Unlike the 13th Warrior would have you believe, despite being an amazing film, Ibn Fadlan didn't make it all the way to Scandinavia, but instead met the Rus somewhere on the Eurasian Steppe. Ibn Fadlan was part of a diplomatic delegation going to meet the Volga Bulgars, a Turkic people whose king had contacted the Abbasid Caliph to ask for instruction in Islam. I'd highly recommend anyone watching to read the Penguin Books edition of the Ibn Fadlan and the Land of Darkness, which is a translation of the account he left behind. It doesn't just contain his now infamous description of the Rus leader's funeral, but also many escapades with the weird and wonderful people that he encountered on his journey. Several Arabic writers did reach Scandinavia itself, though, and may have been responsible for bringing at least some of the Islamic artifacts found there. The first of these was Al-Ghazal, another diplomat like Ibn Fadlan. But unlike Ibn Fadlan, Al-Ghazal served the Emir of Cordoba rather than the Abbasid Caliph. The Abbasid Caliphate was the third caliphate to be established following the death of the Prophet Muhammad, seizing power from the Umayyad Caliphate in the process in AD 747. After several victories over the Umayyads in battle, the Abbasids declared an amnesty for the remaining members and invited them to receive pardons, at which point they were promptly massacred. One of the dynasts to escape was Abd al-Rahman, fleeing across North Africa and then into Iberia, which had been conquered from the Visigoths a few decades earlier. With other loyalists to the old regime, he set up Al-Andalus as a final holdout of the Umayyad Caliphate and made himself emir of its emirate in the capital Cordoba. This would be the second zone in which the Norse would encounter Muslims. Unlike the eastern trade, which was heavily centered on Sweden, contact with Al-Andalus was more likely to be with Denmark and Norway, as several accounts survive of Viking voyages into the Mediterranean to target both Muslim and Christian communities there. Though found in much smaller numbers than the coins from the Middle East, dirhams struck in Al-Andalus also show up in the Scandinavian coin hoards. Abu Zakaria Yahya ibn Hakam al-Bakri al-Jayani received the nickname Al-Ghazal, the gazelle, the English word is borrowed from the Arabic, as a young poet. Though by 845, when he embarked on his mission, he was working for the Emir Abd al-Rahman II. It's likely that the island that he describes being sent to is Denmark, while the other islands are Norway. Of interest is the term used not only by Al-Ghazal, but also by other Arabic authors for the Norse, Majus, a word elsewhere used by Arabic authors to refer to Zoroastrians, the connection possibly being that in their minds they both worshipped fires, as the Norse burned their dead. Many of the Islamic artifacts and exotic costumes have been linked by scholars to the costly presents with him on board, and suggest they may have ended up in Scandinavia as part of these diplomatic missions. Another Arab to reach Scandinavia, specifically to the town of Hilbert, in what was then Denmark but today is Germany, was called Al-Tartushi, who like Al-Ghazal had come from Al-Andalus. He described the town as large, impoverished and filthy, with inhabitants who ate fish, sang like dogs, and worshipped the dog star Sirius. Don't tell Graham Hancock. Ibn Khordadbeh wrote between 844 and 848, during the same years that Al-Ghazal was visiting Scandinavia. Ibn Khordadbeh was of Persian descent, and so wrote from the Abbasid Caliphate in the east about the edges of the world as it was known to Muslims in the mid-9th century. He writes about the Arus, the same people who Ibn Fadlan would meet around a century later, and how they journeyed east with trading goods, the last leg of the journey to Baghdad being made by camel. According to Ibn Khordadbeh, these Arus pretended to be Christian, because, as pupils of the book, the passage and possibly amount of taxation owed was smaller than they would have had to pay if they'd admitted to being pagans. All of these accounts are interesting, and again speak to connections between the Islamic world and the Norse one, where differences in culture and religion could be bridged with gifts and didn't hinder the making of a profit. But all of them are silent on the issue of there being any Muslim Norsemen. If there had been communities of Muslims in Scandinavia, we would certainly expect to hear about them from the Arabs that travelled there. Far-flung new converts like the Bulgars actively sent for help from the Caliph to build a mosque and receive proper Islamic instruction. Yet none of the Arabs that travelled to the north mentioned this as part of their mission. We might also wonder why Ibn Khordadbeh's Arus decided to portray themselves as Christians and not as Muslims, if many of their fellows had become Muslims at the same time. The term Majus clearly links the Norse in the Islamic mind to the pagans that they were more familiar with in the Middle East. Several of the accounts also explicitly mention their conversion to Christianity, but remain silent about any hypothetical conversion to Islam. On the steppe, Ibn Fadlan clearly describes the Arus he encounters as pagans as well. One final example may highlight a slightly different situation. The Khazars are a particularly interesting case of a Turkic steppe confederation which are claimed to have adopted Judaism in the 8th century. Several Arabic authors describe Khazar society. Al-Masudi, writing in 947, noted how at the capital Itil, Muslims, Christians, Jews and pagans lived in different districts, and among the pagans he counted As-Sakaliba, the Slavs, and Al-Rus, a group often associated with the Norse. This source suggests that at least here on the steppe, Muslims and Vikings also lived side by side. This source suggests that at least here on the steppe, Muslims and Norsemen lived side by side. In 969, the Kievan Rus destroyed the Khazars' capital, and archaeologists haven't been able to locate the site to look for the physical evidence to support this idea. There is one line hidden in Ibn Fadlan's account that tells a different story, though there are a few caveats. It says, "In place of gold, the Rus use sable skins. No standard measure is known in the land. They buy and sell by dry measure. They are very fond of pork, and many of them who have assumed the garb of Muslimism miss it very much." This appears to be a direct reference to the Rus who have converted, assumed the garb of Muslimism, even though abstinence from pork proved difficult. However, there are a few reasons to be cautious. The first is that this may not have come from Ibn Fadlan himself. The account of his journey isn't the original manuscript written by the man himself. Instead, it survives in 1. A very incomplete version, 2. A fuller but still not entirely complete version, which is dated to the 13th century and was only discovered in 1923, and 3. Several passages not found in either of the other versions that are quoted by the 16th century geographer Amin Razi. And this passage is one of those quoted by Amin Razi in the 16th century. Even if we take for granted that this is a genuine passage rather than Razi's interpretation, the identity of the Rus has long been debated by scholars who argue that this label probably encompassed a mixed group of Norse, Slavic, and perhaps Baltic, Finnic, and/or Turkic peoples in various combinations and at various places and times on the steppe. A general distinction is made by scholars between the Kievan Rus, centered on Kiev, and whose history is recorded in the Russian Primary Chronicle, and the Volga-Caspian Rus, who lived further east and thus had much more contact with Muslim people, but whose history is far less well understood and attested. Nevertheless, this puts words to what quite a few scholars have long hypothesized, that the conversion of some people of Scandinavian origin might have occurred among those who travelled eastwards and had extensive contact with Muslims. The Volga Bulgars show that other peoples on the steppe became interested in and converted to Islam, and it's true that following the Kievan Rus' destruction of the Khazars, the Bulgars became a key partner of the Volga-Caspian Rus. Islam was clearly still an important player for the Kievan Rus, as well as when Grand Prince Vladimir the Great decided to convert from being a pagan, he invited delegates of several religions to present their case, including a Muslim Bulgar delegation to lay out the case for Islam. This is recorded in the Russian Primary Chronicle, written around a century after the purported events, and it states that Vladimir rejected Islam on account of the ban on eating pork and drinking wine. But too much stock shouldn't be placed in this individualistic account of a considered conversion over broader political factors. So, to return to the article in the Telegraph reporting on the Brilliant Club's new advice to its tutors, what can we make of its claims? Well, it's difficult to say because as far as I'm aware, the exact document the Telegraph quotes from the Brilliant Club isn't publicly available, so it's impossible to tell if these quotes are cherry-picked out of a more nuanced context or not. To quote the relevant section then, the guidance intended to make lessons more relatable for pupils adds that Vikings were, quote, a very diverse group of people with, quote, diverse religious beliefs, and urges the tutors to consider that, quote, some Vikings became practising Muslims. This claim appears to rely on Islamic goods being found in the graves of some Vikings who traded with the Islamic world. In lieu of that, let's look at what the Telegraph says, that the Vikings were a very diverse group of people with diverse religious beliefs, and to consider that some Vikings became practising Muslims. In light of what we've addressed, it's actually quite hard to find fault with this, although it can certainly be nuanced. We know from the analysis of paganism that its manifestations in Scandinavia were varied, with social and geographic differences between areas. Later, we see the Western Scandinavian world come into increasing contact with Catholic Christianity, and in the East with Orthodox Christianity. On the steppe, they also engaged with both nomadic Turkic Tengrists, also Finnic and Slavic pagans, Jewish Khazars, and with the Muslim Volga Bulgars and the Caliphate beyond. The term Rus is difficult because it likely refers to different groups of different cultures and ethnicities at different times and places depending on who is doing the telling. The Rus described by Ibn Fadlan appear to have been influenced in their beliefs possibly by both Slavic paganism and Turkic Tengrist ideas of a green paradise found after death. This is certainly plausible on the steppe, where there was sustained contact with nomadic peoples the Rus were actively engaged with in trade, such as the Khazars and the Volga Bulgars. However, there is no convincing evidence for any religious influence of Islam on the Norse in Scandinavia, the artifacts instead being of an exotic nature and whose original purpose was only partially, if at all, understood. If the emphasis in the last line is placed on the consideration that some Vikings may have become Muslim, this does follow the line of scholarship, though as has been stressed in this video, there is no direct convincing evidence. Again, this would seem to pertain only to the Rus, the Scandinavian adjacent groups operating in the East, although there is ample evidence that there was no Iron Curtain-like divide between Scandinavians in the West and Rus in the East in the Viking Age, and the Rus could just as easily show up in Ireland, Denmark or Frisia. How plausible the maintenance of the Islamic faith in Northern Europe by returning Rus would be, and crucially also how useful for these Scandinavian merchants operating in areas that were populated by Christians and pagans, is an important issue with this hypothetical. In Northern Europe, there were many incentives for Scandinavians to convert to Christianity, including political and economic ones. In contrast to some areas of Eastern Europe, where there were advantages, This doesn't hold true for Islam in Europe at the same time, connected as it was to the Caliphate much further away than, say, the Christian Frankish Empire and its trading networks, or those of the Orthodox Byzantines. What is misleading, and what many of the media reporting has picked up on, is the term diverse, as in modern parlance this is usually used to reflect diversity in a global sense. One of the fascinating things about the Viking Age is that they were trailblazers in linking various parts of the globe, from the Chinese silks and Indian beads found in Birka to the settlements in North America and Viking coins found at Inuit sites in the high Arctic. But to suggest that the Vikings constituted a population that we would recognise as multi-racially diverse in a modern sense with representations of ethnic groups from each continent is misinformed, and tries to back project what is true in the 21st century into the Viking Age. That's not to say that these people didn't exist in Viking Age Scandinavia, which is something I'd like to cover in a similar way in my next video on the Vikings to address some of those claims. Part of this desire to connect modern diverse populations and Muslims in Scandinavia into the past comes in response to previous and continued misappropriations of the Vikings as bulwarks of the white race, refusing to mix with quote-unquote inferior peoples. This polar image of the past is just as wrong, and it's counteracted by the accounts of Rus living alongside, trading with and working for Jews, pagans, Christians and Muslims of various ethnicities in the Khazar capital and on the Eurasian Steppe as a whole. In Scandinavia, men and women happily incorporated foreign fashions and artifacts from the steppe and from further afield in the Muslim world. And influences from other cultures, be it Christian Europe, the Muslim East or the Sami North, can be found rippling through Norse cultures in various ways. There's no need for either an overly revisionist or a racially segregated vision of the Viking Age, because the truth is much more interesting. Rather than being fed a story of dubious practising Muslim Vikings, the amazing far-flung contacts between the Norse and the Islamic world, ranging from the Western Mediterranean to the Eurasian Steppe, is surely enough to capture the imagination. Dragon-headed ships on the Caspian Sea, Indian beads passing through countless hands and ending up around a Swedish woman's neck at her graveside, Ibn Fedlan's fascination with the weird and, well, wonderful might be an overstatement, but interesting customs of the Rus he encountered on his travels. At the end of the day, the Norse valued their Muslim connections across the East, which brought back incalculable wealth and opportunity to even the humblest Swedish farmstead. At the same time, we scholars of the Viking Age value our colleagues in Islamic studies, without whose help we couldn't understand many of the Arabic descriptions and Islamic artifacts that show up in Scandinavia. Without them, we wouldn't know all Ibn Fedlan had to say about Rus funerary and other practices, or some of the earliest descriptions of Scandinavia not told through the often biased Christian lens. When we oversimplify the relations between the Norse and Muslims in the past, we muddy the water of this amazing lagoon of history. School curricula about Viking history should absolutely also teach about their voyages to the East and vice versa, and how the Scandinavian and Islamic worlds intersected, manifesting in both peaceful and violent encounters between cultures. But let's do it properly, and not oversimplify the past by focusing on a hypothetical tiny sliver of the Norse population who may or may not have become Muslim or not have had white skin. And let's not overreact the other way either. The Vikings' horizons were large, and their identities shifted with every migration to suit their new social and political realities, rather than clinging to some idea of racial unity. Anyway, those were my thoughts on the matters. I'd be very curious to hear what you have to say, so please do leave a comment below and join in the discussion, although please do be civil when you do so. Links to the quoted articles will be found in the description below, and I'd appreciate it if you would share the video to those you think would be interested in it. Thank you very much. I have been Hilbert, and this was The History.